Okay, welcome back to Unit 7. We're going to talk about taking action. Remember, the last perceptual process is taking action, right? So we'll talk about taking action and we'll talk about difference between the traditional approach to perception, where we have been talking about all these perceptual processes and the measurements we've used in the context of stationary objects. Now, the question is, we live in a dynamic world. So we'll talk about the ecological versus a traditional approach to studying human perception. Traditional approaches use perceptual processes that we have discussed so far have used stationary observer. The person doesn't move. The objects may move, but the person doesn't move. Now, but that's not how things happen. It's too artificial, right? Ecological approach measures perceptual processes under dynamic conditions of movement. Like just imagine you're driving. When you are driving, how do you perceive? That's a dynamic, and that's the ecological approach. This was proposed by Gibson in 1950s, right? And Gibson felt that the traditional way of measuring perception is too artificial, but the observer doesn't move. But in reality, we actually move, and so in such instances where most of the time we do move, hard to explain or apply what you've learned in stationary situations to more dynamic situations. For instance, how do pilots land airplanes based on the cues they get from the system they're looking at versus the outside? So, according to ecological approach proposed by Gibson, the old by Gibson, when a person moves in the environment, right, then there is relative perception of movement of the objects. Now, when you move, right, you feel like objects are moving towards you. This appearance of objects moving because of your movement is called optic flow. Now, the best example would be when you're driving. As you drive, not only the cars that are approaching you, you feel like are moving, which is very obvious. They are also moving. But you also see like the trees that are moving closer to you first than past you. So this appearance of apparent motion in the objects when you move is called optic flow. That's the first idea. Optic flow. Optic flow is the appearance of objects moving when you move, right? Irrespective whether the objects move or not, when you move, you feel like the objects move. Then there is a gradient flow. Now, when you look at it, right, there is a difference in the flow of objects, meaning that let's say you're driving straight on a bridge, right? There is no other car coming your way, just you're driving, right? When you look at straight, right, the center of this frame, it doesn't move, right? Whereas the objects that are closer to you move faster when compared to the objects that are far from you. And that is represented here. You can see that. Let me highlight that. You can see based on the longer arrows. The arrows determine the optic flow, and the length of the arrows determine the gradient of flow. The longer the arrows represented here, the faster they move. So the objects that are closer to you move faster, and objects that are far from you, they move slower. So these are the two important ideas of ecological approach. Now, optic flow is is appearance of objects moving when you're moving, and these objects move at different rates, and that's called gradient of flow. Objects that are closer to you move faster, objects that are far from you slower. And there is one point at the center which doesn't move, and that is the center. It's called focus of expansion. It's as if the optic flow is coming, expanding from that particular point. It is your focus of where you're focusing on. Everything expands from there. Now, so there were several experiments conducted to see if we actually use this optic flow information. Optic flow information meaning that do we use this apparent feeling of motion of the objects when you move and when driving. So what they did is observers watched a computer generated display of moving dots that kind of created this optic flow kind of information. And the participants were asked, where are you headed? Can you guess where are you headed here? Participants would say they need to say towards the post, to the right of the post or the left of the post. And most of the times their responses corresponded with the flow, meaning that they would say they're going to the post here to the right of the post and to the other left of the post. All these are because of this apparent movement of the objects. So the judgments were based on the optic flow information. This supports the idea that we use optic flow. Now the idea is something like this. When you're in a car and the car is moving, it creates a flow. When there is a flow, which is object moving relative to your car, this provides additional information for you to guide you further move, right? Move forward. And each step you are actually moving based on this apparent flow and the rate of flow of objects around you. That's how you now you need to understand one more thing. Now in attention video, we and if you remember we talked about sensing. I would refer to that video. We talk about how information is captured in snapshots, where our eyes capture information, our sensor organs capture information. This captured information um, is captured and stays in your eyes, in your sensory receptors for 250 to 200 milliseconds. Now, within this 200 milliseconds, your eyes capture for the first 50 milliseconds, and the remaining 150 to 200 milliseconds, your brain is processing what is being captured, right? Then there is another snapshot. Then the brain will capture for 50 milliseconds, and then it will process for the remaining 150 milliseconds. Do you remember that? The saccade and fixation. Fixation, image captured, and that captured image is interpreted for remaining 150 milliseconds. Then your eyes move to a next fixation. So imagine these fixations as new snapshots. And when you're driving, you get a snapshot, then you get another snapshot, then you get another snapshot, then you get another snapshot. Now, again, we're talking about 4 snapshots per second. So when you get these 4 snapshots per second, you'll see things, the frame changing. It's like running a movie on the screen by using these old films, right? There is no actual movement there. There's only an apparent motion, right? Or if you have a flip book, again, please do watch that video on attention. If there is a flip book, right? You see things move in the flip book, but there is actually nothing there moving. It's just a different frames when moved in a different rate, you'll see an apparent motion. Similarly here, when you're moving and you're driving, you see different frames. And these different frames are put together in a frame to give you this apparent feeling of motion. That is true in general and also true when you're moving. This flow is given because of this frames being connected. Now, is it so? Do we actually use optic flow information? Let's take another example of somersaulting. Do you somersault? Now, how do you practice somersaulting? Do you need to have your eyes open to do somersaulting? These researchers, what they did is they asked novices and experts to actually try to do somersaulting with their eyes open and their eyes closed. Now, what they noticed was that experts actually were bad doing somersault with eyes closed than novices. The reason is that experts have learned to use the visual cues to actually get on right track. Because when you take that first jump or turn, right, by looking at where you are, how you are respect to the gravity or the ground, you can course correct yourself and fall correctly, right? That information is lost when you close your eyes. That matters only if you're an expert because you've learned to take the visual cues from the environment. But for a novice who hasn't learned this technique, it doesn't matter whether he's doing with closed or open eyes. So that's the idea here, meaning that you do take the apparent motion of the objects when you're moving in the environment, even when you are somersaulting. And a similar such experiment is when it's called the moving swinging room experiment, where the children were placed in the swinging room where the floor doesn't move, but the ceiling and the front wall would move back and forth, and children were they swayed back and forth in response to the flow patterns created in the room. Where things did not move, it felt like they're moving and they also moved. Adults also showed this response when they were placed in swinging room. So vision has this powerful effect on balance, and vision overrides other senses of feedback. So according to Gibson, even when you're not moving, right, when you're processing information, when you're actually perceiving objects, right, Each object has its own affordances. Affordances are related to those characteristics of the object that gives you an affordance, meaning that gives you information of how to use that object. Let's say if you have a remote, right? This remote, your knowledge of remote is not only about how it looks, what it does, but how you would interact with it to be able to use it for the reason why it is used. So that is part of perception. In other words, irrespective whether you're moving or not, every object has its own affordances, and you activate that information is the idea of affordances provided by it. So perceiving an object is not just identifying what it is. That's what we've discussed so far, right? When you perceive an object, you recognize what it is, you take an action, right? But what ecological approach proposes is that it's not just identifying what the object is, but you also activate what the object affords, or what kind of actions can you do with that object. Those informations also get activated. So I'll pause here.